This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. De-escalation training. Community members say police need these skills to reduce officer-involved shootings. The latest call for change coming after a shooting in New Haven that left a passenger of a car in the hospital. We'll talk to a retired lieutenant from the New Haven Police Department who teaches police officers ways to de-escalate. Ray Hassett joins us later. We'll also hear from State Senator Gary Winfield, co-chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. Winfield has led efforts to pass police accountability laws in our state. First, we get the latest from two recent police shootings in Connecticut. They are two very different cases. Joining us from the New Haven studio for Connecticut Public Radio is Lori Mack. She covers criminal justice. Lori, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lucy.
So, Lori, can you briefly tell us on April 16th what happened exactly in New Haven that led to a police shooting there?
Sure. Shortly before 4:30 in the morning, Hampden police received a 911 call from a gas station mini-mart clerk reporting an attempted armed robbery. He said a customer pulled a gun on the person who delivers the newspapers there and asked him for his money. The dispatcher puts out the call. New Haven is then alerted through a radio hotline, also heard by the Yale Police Department, about a recent robbery with a gun. At that point, Hampden officer Devin Eaton and Yale officer Terrence Pollock end up stopping a car matching the description of the suspects in the Dixwell Avenue area of New Haven, and at this point, things start to move pretty quickly. Two people are in the car, driver Paul Witherspoon and Stephanie Washington, and they're blocked in. Witherspoon told investigators that his window didn't work, and he opened the door to show police his hands, and that's when police started firing.
We understand that there were cameras on the scene, but not much footage. Tell us about why, and for the stuff that is available, how long did it take for it to come out?
Sure. So let's start with a Yale police officer who was outfitted with a body camera and a dash cam. He doesn't turn either one of them on. So there's no footage from the Yale police officer. The Hampden police officer has a body cam, but they do not have dash cameras. He turns on, speaking about Hampden, the Hampden police officer turns on his body cam after the shooting begins, but there's a recall function which grabs about 30 seconds of video prior to an officer hitting record. So they do have some footage from the Hampden police officer, but it's not a lot. And so at this point, they need to send out that footage for enhancement.
Coming up, we're going to hear about some laws or guidance that police departments get throughout the state. What has State Police Commissioner Ravella said about with the fact that these cams weren't turned on when they should have been?
Right. He said that it was inconsistent with state statute and recommended policy and procedure. But he also said that some departments have other rules. Now, as far as Hampden is concerned, all of their officers have been issued body cams, but their policy states that officers are supposed to activate those body cams at the inception of an interaction with public in a law enforcement capacity. However, they also point out that police shouldn't put their safety or the safety of the public at risk just for the purpose of activating a body cam.
I mentioned that someone was injured in this specific shooting. How many shots were fired on the scene, Lori?
16 total, 13 by the Hampden police officer and 3 by the Yale police officer. The Yale police officer was also injured. The police did not go into the specifics of his injuries, but said he was injured, they believe, by a projectile.
And a woman, Stephanie Washington, was a passenger in that car. Is she still recovering?
Yes, she suffered a non-life-threatening injury.
We know the investigation is continuing, but was anyone in that car armed, Lori?
No. So police have reported that there were no guns found at the scene, and they had recently had released a search and seizure warrant, or an application for a search and seizure of the car, and found that there were no guns in the car as well.
Lori Mack is joining us from the New Haven studio of Connecticut Public Radio. She covers criminal justice, and today we're talking about two recent officer-involved shootings. The first one happening in New Haven. Lori was giving us the rundown of that particular incident. Lori, you've also been talking to community members. I understand there was a prayer service just yesterday. What are you hearing from the community about this particular incident?
So yesterday's service was really different. It was, first of all, it was focused on healing and bringing the community and the police together. It was not a protest. They were not delivering a message of firing the cops. It was very different. It was uplifting, and it was welcoming. There were several members of the New Haven Board of Alders that attended. There was a Hamden Lieutenant Frank McDermott attended, Hamden Acting Police Chief John Cappiello, and from New Haven, there was Police Captain Anthony Duff, who was representing Mayor Tony Harp and the New Haven Police Department. And after talking with them following the service, they all seemed to feel that it was a positive message and just upbeat in general.
So while that was a tone of healing and having the community come together, prior to that, there were almost daily protests after this shooting in New Haven. What do the protesters, the other community members, activists, what do they want to see happen, Lori?
So at first, they wanted transparency. They wanted the names released, and that happened rather quickly, like by the next day. Then they wanted the body cam footage released, and that happened exactly 1 week later, which, by the way, is unprecedented. That's very out of the norm. Usually, footage is not released until after an investigation is complete. However, the state has been really committed to being transparent and releasing as much information as they possibly can without harming the investigation.
There have been several press conferences, including religious leaders. I understand some of those religious leaders, like Reverend John Lewis, are calling for additional training, like de-escalation and also urban trauma training. Here's a clip of what he said last Wednesday.
Too often we want to do a 6-hour training or a training that lasts for 2 days and that's done. No, this kind of training helps develop relationship, and it helps be able to put it in a place where there's some engagement there. And that's important because you won't shoot somebody as quick if you got a relationship with them.
Lori, what have you been hearing about when this investigation will be completed? You mentioned that body cam footage was released, and that was unprecedented. But how long is it going to take to figure out what exactly happened there?
Well, State Police Commissioner James Ravella revealed last week during a press conference last Wednesday that they believe that the investigation could last 2 to 3 months. As I said before, they've taken the footage and sent it out for enhancement, and the officers are on leave.
Lori Mack again covers criminal justice for Connecticut Public Radio, joining us today from our New Haven studio. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I wanted to turn to another officer-involved shooting that happened just days after that New Haven shooting. In studio with me is Ryan Lindsay, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. Ryan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us what happened in this shooting in the Hartford area. Actually, it was in Wethersfield, where an 18-year-old was shot and killed by a police officer. I understand it all started as a traffic stop. How did it end up this way?
Yeah, so 18-year-old Anthony Jose Vega Cruz, his friends and family call him Chulo, was driving in Wethersfield, and police attempted to pull him over. All we have so far is sort of what the police have been reporting. And so in that traffic stop, they stopped the car. They say that Cruz tried to pull away. At some point, there was a collision with another police cruiser. And then the police say that Cruz drove towards an officer who then fired into the vehicle. Cruz was shot in the head twice. This was around 6 p.m. last Saturday. And then he was on life support, and then he passed away from his wounds on Monday. So that incident has, coupled with the shooting in New Haven, has caused a lot of unrest and, just reactions within the community.
We heard from Lori that there were issues with Yale and Hamden officers involved in that shooting when they had their body cams on. But in this Wethersfield incident, does the police department have body cams at all?
No, so not in Wethersfield. There is dash cam footage that the investigation is now in the hands of Gail P. Hardy, the state's attorney in Hartford. She did put out a statement last week saying that she does want to release that footage, but only when she's able to determine that won't interfere with the investigation. And so a lot of cries from the community are raising the question, why can't officers handle these traffic situations in another way? Actually, 2 years ago today, 15-year-old Jordan Edwards in Texas was shot and killed while riding in the passenger seat. And so that was something that echoes something from the past. In New York, NYPD in 1972 created a rule that basically disallowed police officers from shooting into vehicles while they're moving. In the Washington Post in recent years has reported that there's been over 200 people who've been killed by police in a moving vehicle since 2015. So this is something that's not just happening here in Connecticut, but also across the country.
How has the Wethersfield Police Department responded about this particular incident, and then even what you've mentioned, certain standards that are in play to keep this from happening?
Sure. I absolutely can't speak for the police department as a whole. I can only share what I've observed. And so there has been a noticeable level of tension between, in particular, I think, James Setrin, the police chief of Wethersfield, who in the past has denied reports that have come out from the Connecticut Racial Profiling Project. I think it's CRP3 is their acronym. That has shown in the past few years, I believe since 2015, that Wethersfield does have a problem when it comes to what they call racial discrepancies when it comes to police stop or traffic stops. So at one of the protests, he came outside. Protesters and family members were calling, "We want the chief, we want the chief." He comes out. They were upset because there was apparently video of him laughing when someone was asking if the shooting was under investigation. So a lot of sort of salt on the wound instances. And then on Thursday at the protests, there were a group of younger folks from Hartford who marched from Hartford to Wethersfield to meet up with another group. And he stood outside, was behind police barricades, didn't really say anything. And so, it's just been interesting to observe sort of that those interactions or lack thereof.
You mentioned the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, and since 2015, they have analyzed more than 100 police departments in the state of Connecticut. We should note Wethersfield's the only department that's been in the top 5 each year when you look at the degree of racial disparities in their traffic stop data.
Right. Yeah, if you look at Silas Deane Highway, which was where Chulo was stopped, they break it up into 3 portions. So there's the northern portion, the middle, and the southern portion. The southern portion being closer to Rocky Hill, the northern being closer to Hartford. And so what their research has shown is that there are a higher number of police stops on that northern border, the Hartford border. And in addition, there's a significant number, or what they call not discrepancies, but I should say racial disparities of who's being stopped. And so a lot of Black and brown people coming in and out of Wethersfield, there's a grocery store there that a lot of folks populate, are being exposed to more policing. And it's for things like some maybe dark tints, some sort of equipment malfunction is what they call. So if your tail light is out or something's wrong with your car, those are the reasons that you're going to get stopped closer to that border. Whereas on the southern end of Silas Deane Highway, if you're speeding, if you run a stoplight or a stop sign, those are going to be more safety-related reasons why you're stopped. And so generally, the research has shown that white drivers are not exposed to or subjected to the same amount of treatment. And also something that's worth highlighting is that generally, nationwide, Black men are 3 times more likely to be killed by police use of force, and Latino men, and not even men, but this is really Black and Latino males over the age of 10 years old, are more likely to be subjected to police use of force, and then 3 and 2 times more likely to be killed by that use of force.
Ryan Lindsay, again, is a Hartford-based reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. We're talking about this recent officer-involved shooting in Wethersfield that resulted in an 18-year-old being killed in what started as a traffic stop. Ryan, I understand that you covered the wake of Mr. Cruz. When family and community members are talking about him and what has happened, are they also talking about gun violence broadly? I understand you also spoke to some people that are looking for change there as well.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Rodney Williams is Paul Witherspoon's uncle, and so he was at the press conference when they released the body cam footage up in New Haven. And so he was at the wake. He was at the protest on Thursday, and he's definitely been involved in, sharing what they're experiencing with the 2 families. And so there is a conversation of, again, why is it when, there's an opportunity to de-escalate or approach a traffic stop in a different way, and this is something that Bishop Selder said, why do Black and brown people get bullets instead of something else in these type of interactions? So there are these conversations. And in general, this is nothing new. We saw a couple years back in 2017 that a 15-year-old Jason Negron was shot and killed by a police officer up in Bridgeport. That officer went to trial, but did not have and end up seeing any jail time from that. And that was, again, when an officer decided to pursue on foot a vehicle, and the young man was driving the vehicle. And so there's not a lot of questions about why does this continue to happen, and also, calls for justice. Folks in the community want these officers to be able to go to have their day in court to see, okay, was this police use of force justified beyond the officer claiming or saying that they were using that because they feared for their life.
We should mention around the same time that Anthony Vega Cruz was killed, there was a 16-year-old Hartford teenager that was killed. You spoke to Javon Alston, a close friend of Mr. Cruz, at a protest last week.
We're fighting for everybody, not just Chulo, exactly, for anybody who's been killed. There's a lot of murders going on, and we just want it to all be stopped, whether it's from the police or just each other. I don't want any killings or deaths the wrong way. We just hope it all be resolved and everybody, just live and do better. That's all.
Again, that was Javon Alston. I want to thank Ryan Lindsay for telling us some more about this situation in Wethersfield. Before we let you go, the timeline of when the state's attorney investigation will conclude.
Yeah, I think generally people are holding their breath for this body cam footage. The state's attorney's office hasn't given any information about when that's going to be released. And even with the New Haven and Hampden investigation, Ravella said that it could be another 2 or 3 months before that investigation is included. So we're just sort of kind of taking it day by day and seeing what information is released and what develops in these two investigations.
Ryan Lindsay, a reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. Ryan, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Also, thanks to Lori Mack, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio based in New Haven. Coming up, what laws does Connecticut have that call for police accountability when excessive force is used? State Senator Gary Winfield will join us, and you can join our conversation too. 860-275-7266 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. When there is an officer-involved shooting of an unarmed person, often there are calls for police to be held accountable when a shooting appears unjustified. Community members also question how law enforcement is trained and whether there'll be changes to avoid deadly force. Coming up, we'll learn why a retired New Haven police lieutenant offers de-escalation training to police departments and members of the public. First, to the police accountability question, State Senator Gary Winfield has led efforts to hold police officers to stricter standards through legislation before the Connecticut General Assembly. Senator Winfield joins us now in studio to talk about why certain proposals have stalled in recent years. And you can join us too, the number 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Senator Gary Winfield, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me again.
I mentioned that you're co-chair of the Judiciary Committee. You also represent New Haven and West Haven. So let's start with body cams. We heard from WNPR reporters that Wethersfield doesn't use them. There were questions about when Hamden and Yale officers involved in that New Haven shooting had turned them on. So what does legislation that passed in 2015 actually say about when police officers should have these body cameras on and how they should be used?
So the legislation that we passed in 2015 allowed for the police officer standards and training to promulgate the regulations around body cameras. What their body camera regulations say suggest that in certain interactions, body cameras should be turned on. So, for instance, the interaction that we were talking about in New Haven, from my reading of the regulation, the officers knew that they were going to be on a scene where they were interacting with individuals and should have had their body cameras on. In terms of the cars and the cameras that are on the cars, it has always been my understanding that when the lights go on, the cameras go on. So as I've been listening to this, it's been a little interesting to me that the camera in the Yale car wasn't on. And I guess that's a question that's still out there. But what we attempted to do in 2015 was to make sure that, one, we had body cameras. Prior to that, body cameras were not something that the state itself had really weighed in on. And so we created a program where police agencies could avail themselves of funds that the state had set aside for the body cameras, kind of to entice them. And any agency that had availed themselves of those funds would be subject to the regulations promulgated by Post.
So how many police departments took the state up on that offer?
Not enough. I don't know off the top of my head, but that was a continued struggle that we had trying to get police departments to avail themselves. So what we did was we created kind of a waning of the funds, right? So if you don't take the funds in the first year, if you take them in the second year, you would get 75% of the funds, and it went down like that. Kind of to say, at some point, given what's happening with the national conversation, we're going to have body cameras, and it wouldn't make sense for you to leave the funds on the table. Having said that, there are police departments that did.
So for the police departments that did take the state funding, that have these body cams in a situation where they're not being used properly, what are the ramifications, the consequences for that?
Very little. So this gets into the conversation about police accountability bills that have been in the General Assembly. So the 2015 bill started off much stronger than it ultimately was. And it wasn't just about body cameras, to be sure. It also was about what happens when there is a police-involved shooting and an officer is found guilty or pleads that no contest or something of that nature with that officer going forward. So that officer would not be hired again in the state of Connecticut. That officer also, if we knew that they went outside of our jurisdiction, but we knew where they went, we'd be required to let them know what happened. So there are those kind of reporting things, but there's very little from my perspective, serious punishment. Not that punishment is necessarily what we're trying to do, but I think punishments are important, or at least thinking about repercussions for an action. And so in the General Assembly, there are a lot of people who are concerned about what's happening with the police. But when we're operating, the lobby for the police is stronger than the lobby for the people. And it has had a huge impact on whether or not we can move any of this legislation.
When you mentioned the pushback, what is the feeling, the general sentiment that as long as someone complies with a police officer's request that nothing bad is going to happen? Or they acknowledge that there are incidents, we've seen it across this country, where Philando Castile did everything that he was supposed to and he was still murdered?
I think there's kind of, and I was in the military for a while, so I understand this to a degree. I think there's kind of this imagination about the person who puts on a uniform and who that person is. But I would say to the general public and to the police themselves that the day before you put on that uniform is the same person you are the day you put that uniform on. You might feel a sense of responsibility you didn't feel, but you're essentially the same person. And so the mere fact that you put the uniform on doesn't say whether you're good or bad. And in our kind of public conversation, police are good. And so in the General Assembly, that's what it is. And so it means that anytime we try to raise accountability for police, we are saying that police are bad, which is not what's happening. And I will say one thing that I said on social media this weekend. I'm not really interested in having that conversation about good police until police who are good are interested in having a conversation about police accountability.
State Senator Gary Winfield is in studio with us here on Where We Live. He co-chairs the Judiciary Committee, represents New Haven and West Haven as we talk about efforts to have police accountability laws in effect in the state of Connecticut. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Let's talk about racial profiling. We heard about this specific board, the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project Advisory Board that looks at data from municipalities. We hear that Wethersfield, where this officer-involved shooting happened recently, is on the top 5 of racial disparities. So when we think about this data being, gathered, what more should be happening around just making sure that we have the data in terms of turning it into policy that helps both the police and the public?
Yeah, so the racial profiling law that we did, I think, was good in that we now yield more data than we actually had in the past. And relating it to the conversation we're currently having, there's data that we're missing. So we have some of this data on racial profiling, and there's stuff that we could do. We could use the Office of Policy and Management and any grants that they might give to police departments as kind of a a lure, if you will, to kind of control some behavior. But we also have to think about the fact that we don't have data around the use of force. So while it's not the racial profiling issue, it's a very important issue. So we don't know what happens demographically with the use of force. We don't know what happens. And by use of force, I don't just mean the discharge of a gun. I also think of police chases as a use of force. So we don't have information around any of those things. And if I'm, which I am, looking to do something around police accountability, I'm looking to pull these things in so that at the end of the day, we can really know what's happening in the state of Connecticut, and we can figure out, based on what's happening, what the appropriate responses are.
We heard WNPR reporter Ryan Lindsay mention New York City changing rules related to when an officer shoots. Do they shoot into a moving vehicle? Mm-hmm. Are these things that are being talked about in the Connecticut General Assembly?
These are things that have been talked about several times. Representative Robin Porter had an attempt at a bill in 2017, and that was part of the bill that she had forbidding that very action. As you might imagine, that bill did not go very far. But I think given what's happened currently, this is a perfect time to open that conversation back up before the end of the legislative session. So I would imagine that you will hear in the next week or two a lot of talk coming out of the legislative office building about that very subject.
We hear as well when a shooting happens and it's fatal involving a police officer that the investigation is carried out by the state's attorneys outside of that local district. Any changes that you see that are necessary to ensure that there are fair investigations whenever excessive force is used, whether it's a fatality or not?
So I'm glad you bring that up. So over the weekend, I've been working on language to update what we do with police accountability. And what I'm working on is adding to the fatality the use of force, which, while it's not fatal, could lead to a fatality. So the discharge of a gun is potentially fatal whether you kill someone or not. So that is captured in the way that we currently deal with fatalities. I think it's important to capture those things as well. So there is an effort underway, and I've had conversation with some of my colleagues about that this weekend. So there is an effort underway to do some of, and by the way, that was part of the original bill in 2015. We could not get it passed. But there's an effort to go back to what we originally were intending and see if we could get it in law going forward. So yes.
Senator Gary Winfield, again, co-chairs the Judiciary Committee. We mentioned that you're working on several measures to make police accountability stronger in our state. You say that there's been talk this session. You're going to work towards it in the future before it ends. But, what's the likelihood that you see your colleagues, supporting this when there's so much on the plates of state lawmakers? When will this become a real priority in your view?
Those are several questions. So the likelihood, I think given what has happened in this state, the conversation is different. It is contemporary. It is a hot conversation. I am someone who understands how to use those conversations, so that is the reason why my effort has increased in the last few days to revisit some of the things we've done in the past. I've engaged with people who are outside of the legislative office building because I believe that oftentimes when we're trying to get some of the most thorny things through that building, the effort can't be just the effort of a legislator. That's a good way to kill it. And so I'm hoping that through those efforts, what we will hear in the building is an outcry from the public that they want something done. And together that will allow us to have a level of success we have not in the past.
We heard from Josh on Twitter related to our previous conversation, Senator Winfield. He writes, we need to talk about why the legislature is so reluctant to create meaningful punitive police oversight. He believes it's rooted in widespread public perception that police have very dangerous jobs and that the Black and Latinx neighborhoods they patrol are very violent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So if you start off with the premise that people who put on uniforms are necessarily good. If you start off with the premise that the job is necessarily dangerous at all times and that they're patrolling neighborhoods that are inherently dangerous because of the fact that Black and Latin American people live there, you're going to side with the police when it comes to efforts to squelch police accountability. And I think that's why part of the conversation requires that legislators who engage publicly on shows like yours, on social media, say what is real. It is real that we have good and bad police. It is real that neighborhoods where people of color live have levels of violence that they don't like, but that doesn't make the neighborhood inherently bad. And if we're going to have those conversations, then we should be having conversations about why those neighborhoods have those levels of violence, which is completely not part of the conversation. And so I think these conversations are overly simplistic. And when you have these overly simplistic conversations, it is useful to keeping the legislature, those people who endeavor to do so, from moving forward police accountability legislation.
Before we head to break, Senator Winfield, I wanted to ask you how police contracts are worded in terms of, protecting officers, especially if they're involved in shooting investigations. Does that hamper the ability to have certain accountability measures that you and your colleagues are trying to do before the General Assembly?
It can. I will also say that part of the legislation that was passed required that at a certain point, I don't remember the exact date, police contracts going forward couldn't hamper the accountability that we put in the 2015 law. Because if you don't have that explicitly out there, then those contracts that we are concerned about can actually supersede the law. And so that's part of the effort to deal with the fact that in Connecticut, contracts have a lot of power. And so, this is a difficult conversation for many reasons. Part of it is the unique way in which contracts have power sometimes over the actual laws we have if they're not explicit in certain ways.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest in studio is State Senator Gary Winfield. We hope he sticks around as we focus on the training police officers receive, including de-escalation training. We're going to talk to a retired New Haven lieutenant who specializes in this, and we want to hear from you too. Join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, what steps can be taken to reduce violent encounters between the public and police? My next guest is a retired police lieutenant who now offers de-escalation training to law enforcement and the public. Ray Hassett's a former lieutenant with the New Haven Police Department. Ray, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Also to mention that State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven, is also here in studio. And you can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live, or call in 860-275-7266. Ray, we've heard in the last week or so, there are community members down the New Haven area that are asking that officers get more de-escalation training. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's de-escalation training is not a simple product. It's a different way of looking how you communicate. More importantly, it's based on how you listen to people. De-escalation is not about talking with anybody. It's not about talking to somebody. It's about listening to what their position is.
So you were a police officer for more than 2 decades. How did you, realize that maybe this is something that you could help fellow officers, now that you're retired, do better?
So the important thing to learn about my background is that for the last 14 years of my career, I ran one of the busiest districts in New Haven, and I ran it from my car. I didn't go back into the office. I stayed in the street for 14 years. And quite frankly, it was one of the biggest learning experiences for me as a police officer and as a human being to understand where I fit in a particular culture.
When I was looking at the the workshop or the training that you do online, you mentioned that police officers on the front line receive little or no formal training in managing powerful emotions, often the first on the scene when something is happening. So walk us through when you're talking with police officers. What are some ways that you're telling them to de-escalate so that there isn't something bad that's going to happen in the next few minutes?
Well, the first thing that the de-escalation course that I teach has actually evolved to a connection course first. To give it some context, I work a lot overseas. I work in different cultures where it's not as fast-paced as ours. And when you're speaking with someone, they are 100% present in that conversation. They have your undivided attention, and you give them your undivided attention. In our culture, we're wired to multitask. So where that affects somebody in crisis is that when they really need you, you don't realize it, that they're looking for you to listen rather than to give them direction. They're not ready to hear your direction. So how this training has evolved is that we train police officers and the public on how to listen and what to listen for. And also to realize when you show up, even if you have the best intentions in the world, in that first minute, you may be actually making things worse.
We're talking to you after there were 2 recent police shootings in Connecticut. Do you feel like the de-escalation training is needed now more than ever? Has something changed with the way the public and the police interact?
Oh, yes, indeed. I think I think that our brand in law enforcement is not current. I think that public service is not current. I think people are tired of government. I think we are not as responsive to people when they need something. We've forgotten really what our role is really to help. And until people are ready to accept our help, so we're consistent, we keep showing up. We're not just problem solvers. We can't fix people. I think that's where we need to start.
When we think about empathy, and that's something that you talk about in these trainings, what about just understanding of respect, whether it's respect for the officer or respect for that person that the police officer is talking to, and how that can get fuzzy, and that's how things can sometimes escalate, even if that wasn't the intention?
It's every time you meet someone, they do the math on whether or not they can trust you, whether they like you, whether they feel comfortable with you. Part of the training is understanding that we're looking for that sweet spot in communication with everybody in order to begin a relationship so that we can actually get to the business at hand. But you got to recognize that first 5 seconds, that first 10 seconds, a lot of math is being done with the human brain.
Again, in studio with me is Ray Hassett. He's a retired lieutenant with the New Haven Police Department. He now conducts de-escalation trainings for not only law enforcement but the public. You can join our conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. State Senator Gary Winfield's with us as well. You're talking about police accountability laws before the General Assembly, but when you hear about efforts to give de-escalation training to police officers, I mean, how do you respond, and do you think that it's effective?
Well, I think it would have to be more widespread for me to comment on its effectiveness. I believe it would be. I think police officers who go into communities of color have to realize that they're not just going in as individuals as well, right? And they're not just going in with the current police department that exists in that municipality. They're going in with a historical context behind them. And so if you walk into a community and you're expecting people to respect the fact that you sit in your uniform, you have to also understand that that uniform is connected to a history in that particular community of interactions. And so it's particularly, from my perspective, it is particularly important that police recognize how to connect with people, that they recognize how to not allow a situation that doesn't necessarily need to escalate. I think it is, I can't talk about its effectiveness because of a particular program, but I know that the concept is important to dealing with communities that have felt as if they're under siege.
You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Joining the conversation now is Jim Nemfois, who works for POST. So that's Police Officer Standards and Training, I believe. Jim, tell us exactly what POST stands for and what you do there.
Good morning. Yes, POST is the Police Officer Standards and Training Council, and we're responsible for training all municipal police officers in the state of Connecticut, and we do that training through the Connecticut Police Academy, where it's overseen.
We're talking with retired Lieutenant Ray Hassett, who worked with the New Haven Police Department for more than 2 decades. He also conducts de-escalation trainings. Jim, how long has POST been offering de-escalation training to police officers around our state?
Well, de-escalation training has been part of police basic training, ever since the inception. What we do is de-escalate situations. We have new programs here that one of them is the LEADS program. It's Law Enforcement Active Diffusion Strategies. That is part of our basic training curriculum. But de-escalation is covered in so many different aspects that we do here at the Connecticut Police Academy. We talk about it during use of force. We talk about doing interpersonal communications. We talk about it doing conflict management. It's something the police have been doing our entire history.
Jim, you mentioned that this is something that police officers have gotten from the inception, but when we look at different communities around our country where there is more distrust of police, where there have been police shootings of unarmed individuals, how has that training that POST offers responded to that climate and that tension to help officers today when they're speaking with members of the public?
Well, communication, as was talked about, is key. Obviously, we have to establish a dialogue to try to, alleviate any situation that's going on. Doing so calmly, looking at a big picture, recognizing how to use good procedures and good tactics to get a voluntary compliance, to have people comply with, legal, lawful orders. But we also have to recognize that law enforcement is the most dangerous profession in the country right now. An officer is 3 times more likely to get hurt than anybody else working in America right now. It's a dangerous job. Unfortunately, we don't hear a lot of times about when things have been de-escalated. We can de-escalate 99 situations, but that one situation where somebody does not want to comply with society's rules may lead to a situation where the officer has to use force. So it's a very complicated situation.
Jim, when you talk about training officers around the state, do all local police departments get the type of training you're talking about?
Well, as what I can speak to is the basic training program here at the Police Academy for municipal officers. They're required to complete 800 and something hours of training before they go out to their agencies for their field training. Then once they pass their field training, they become a certified police officer. At that point, it's up to the agencies to comply with state law on how much training they get. There's a minimum they need to get. But what type of training, the parameters are open for a good part to the agency. So we will give a base. We will give a solid, well-founded base in communication, making good decisions, the proper procedure to be a good, effective police officer. But we only see an officer for 2% of their career.
Jim Nemfois again is with POST. Thank you for giving us some clarification on what POST offers officers around the state. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
You too. I wanted to go back to Ray Hassett, something that Jim mentioned, that they provide a base for officers. It's up to the local police departments to then see if police officers should be receiving continued training. Is that a gap that you see that needs to be more continuous and throughout a police officer's career, not just when they're getting their certification to be a police officer?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a foundation, it's a basis. But, communication is an art. If you don't practice, if you're not out there daily learning how to adapt and adjust and read behavior, your skills atrophy. You get stuck. If you're used to dealing with, a particular is really where things are at their most volatile. People are they're emotional. They're at skyrocketing. So what's happened, ironically, is that the average job, as far as there's nothing routine in policing, whether it's retail or policing, the first human contact with someone can be the most complex experience in their life. So that other person, that officer, has to have some incredibly sophisticated skills on how to understand and help that person to de-escalate themselves. This is an art. It's not a tool.
Ray Hassett, again, you were a police officer for many years within the New Haven Police Department. We hear throughout the different tenures of many different New Haven police chiefs in recent years this idea of returning to community policing, building relationships so that public doesn't just see police when something bad is happening.
Well, I think going back to my last 14 years, I was there through thick and thin. I was there when things had to be done, and I was also there when we made mistakes. I had to fix stuff. I had to listen. I had to be humbled. I had to figure out where I fit. I had to feel where I fit in a neighborhood, and that involves some maturity. It involves some life experience, but it involves constantly being able to re-examine your skills. Sometimes your skills don't work.
State Senator Gary Winfield, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation because earlier we were talking about police accountability and standards in place. Is this something that state lawmakers should think about? Like, how could there be mandatory de-escalation training that is more consistent and not just at a certain point in a career?
So I want to little frustrated by what I just heard, right? So I don't disagree that it's part of the basic training, but there's kind of this passing of the responsibility around. So whenever we make an attempt as state legislators to change the law where police accountability is included, whether it be what we're talking about currently or anything else, we get sent back to post. And so posts can speak without promulgating regulations. They can speak because they think it's important. Posts could say to the legislature, you know what we think is important, but that's not what's happening. The other thing I want to say is that when you're in community, the actions you take, all of the actions you take are important. So I've engaged with police officers, and I've engaged with phenomenal police officers, but I've engaged with police officers who recognize that I'm the state senator where we're standing. And the conversation is not a conversation that should happen. So if that's happening to me, I can only imagine what happens to other people. And there's this thing that goes on, this constant conversation, and Officer Hassett probably has heard this conversation before. I've sat at my house at the corner of Winchester Division in New Haven, watched officers blow through the light with their turn the lights on. And because I am who I am, I've actually walked, because I've seen them stop up. I've walked up the hill to find out why they had to do it. And I've actually had an officer say to me he didn't want to sit at the light, right? That increases the tension with the community, because what the community sees is a level of what they perceive as disrespect. And so we have to have different conversations even than what we're having. We cannot say, well, it's part of the basic training, so we're good to go. We cannot say that when I come to you and I give you an order, even if I'm not even supposed to be giving you an order, I'm supposed to be just having a conversation with you. You have to respect it because I sit in this uniform and that's the beginning, end, and middle and end of the conversation. So it is difficult for legislators, given the way things work, to make these things happen. But I think these conversations have to happen in a different way than they currently are happening.
Ray Hassett, we just have a couple of minutes left. Did you want to respond to what State Senator Gary Winfield was saying?
Absolutely. I think he's absolutely correct. Everything is in play now with our brand, with how people perceive us. We have to be the example. We have to set the tone, but most importantly, when we show up, people have to trust us. We can't begin to do business until there's that level of trust. It's how the brain works. It's how the soul works. It's how basically people perceive each other. So I go back to the art of connection, and the art of connection is making it all about the other person. You already know who you are.
Ray Hassett, again, is retired lieutenant with the New Haven Police Department who offers de-escalation trainings for law enforcement and the public. Ray, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Also, State Senator Gary Winfield, who co-chairs the Judiciary Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. State Senator Winfield, thanks for your flexibility.
Thanks for having me again.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to Kyone Wolf, who's our technical producer. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.